purpose of Freethought Forum is to be vigilant to the encroachment of religion into government and to educate the general public as to what a freethinker is.
My thoughts give me power.
No scholar can map them.
No hunter can trap them. No person can deny. Die Gedanken sind frei. No person can deny. Die Gedanken sind frei.
Welcome to Freethought Forum. Sorry about that. The frog was in my throat. I'm Catherine Fahringer, the producer of this show, sometime the host. And today I'm sharing the duties with my friend Don Lawrence. The school voucher subject has been hot in the news of late, and I feel very fortunate to have with me as our guest today, Julio Noboa, who is really up on this. And he is, as you can see over here, perhaps we could have a little play on some of the work he's done for the Express News. I'm quite a fan of his, as you can tell. So welcome, Julio. We have next to Julio, we have Sally Chizek, who is also going to be on the panel, and then Don Lawrence, who will close the show. Julio, can you tell us, how do you want to start this? Do you want to start with your experience last week at the voucher debate?
That was a very good experience. I had the opportunity of listening to many statewide leaders, legislators and advocates from both sides of the debate. Mm-hmm. And I must confess it didn't change my mind about the basic problems and issues related to vouchers, but it did bring in another dimension. Up to that point, I had always thought, and I still do to a certain extent, that private monies for private vouchers doesn't really harm or doesn't really affect public schooling. Unfortunately, that's not true. And that I learned from observing the situation at Edgewood District. And certainly because of my observation and because of the articles that come out and the facts surrounding that situation, it's clear that even when generosity is applied to provide to low-income families the opportunity of going to private schools with private money, public schooling is also affected in a negative way.
A very negative way. Edgewood is suffering something terrible. I talked to a woman last night whose son teaches there. What do you forecast now for Edgewood? It doesn't look good. Some of the teachers, I understand, may even lose their jobs. Is this going to be one of the fallouts?
There's probably going to be a lot of fallouts. Already they've lost the enrollment of 700 students, and that is through this program. And what happens is that these are students that usually score very high on the TOS test. And basically we need to understand that with this situation, private schools can choose, or in this case, the program that's funding this can decide which families they're going to fund. And then there's another level of filtering where the private schools themselves can decide which students they will accept and which ones they'll reject. And this is one of the fundamental differences between what happens when the public monies funds public schooling versus when public money funds private schooling. And I'd like to talk about that very briefly, if I may. If you keep public monies for public schooling, what you're doing is accepting all children, regardless of their intelligence, regardless of their ability, regardless of their ability to pay or their income. Public schools are obligated to accept everybody. Private schools, and specifically private parochial schools, are not. And so what happens is that in the public schooling, there's an obligation as well as an opportunity to equalize historic disparities. We know that for years, because of the Edgewood suit and before that time, that Texas has done a poor job, as have other states, in providing poor children with an equal level of funding. For whatever reasons, it's discrimination, there's many other reasons for that. But the point is that with public schooling, at least there's an opportunity to equalize those disparities, but not in private schooling. And what happens is that you create schooling for haves and schooling for have-nots. Mm-hmm. And what you do is actually create more disparity between the rich and the poor when you use this system.
I think it sounds terrible because there will be those 700 children, okay, they get a special favor. This isn't choice, this is favoritism over the select of the public schools, I would say.
And that's affecting the scores, the TOS scores, because if they take the brightest students away, then, and I'm not saying the public schools should not improve and make attempts to improve, and they have been improving, but it's really unfair to them that they're saddled with this. Now, basically, I have a phrase for this. It's generosity cannot replace justice. In other words, there's been a lot of injustice through the years that's created the poor districts and the problems that they have. Generosity is nice, but generosity cannot replace justice, and that's what we have here.
Well, we certainly do, and Sally has some experience with schools, and she certainly looked at this voucher thing. And did you have anything special that you wanted to ask Julio, or is anything on your mind? Well, we've got this wonderful man here. Let's jump on him.
Well, did you read that article from in the Express News, Kerry Clack, where he had an analogy of the new ship and the old ship, the new ship being the USS CEO and the old one being the USS Edgewood? Oops. And he made a good point, saying that the old ship, Edgewood, needed repairs, which is what you're saying. And the new ship comes and he says, well, I can take some of these children. I'm not going to give you any money to repair it, but I can take some of the children, but not all of them. Mm-hmm. So then, just like you're saying, the cream of the crop will be gone. And, well, not all of them, but, you know, a good part of them, because they are going to be very selective. They don't have to follow the same rules that the public schools do.
If you were one of those poorer kids that didn't get picked by that CEO, and by the way, explains that that doesn't stand for Christian something or other, or it doesn't stand for the head of a big business. It's children's educational opportunities. But what about the ones that are left behind? Isn't that going to give them a terrible? I have an inferiority complex for the rest of my life. I didn't get picked.
Well, and not only that, it's a political thing.
Well, they're not just playing games with children, which I think is
that's
mean.
Right. The name it sounds great, doesn't it? Opportunity for children.
Sure.
Sounds great.
Right, Julio?
Yeah, some children, and I think there's another issue when you say about politics, is that the public, when you have public monies for public schools, the public has access, and potential access and influence, and perhaps even control of key aspects of public schooling. Mm-hmm. And but when you have public monies going to private schools, the public has no access, cannot influence that, cannot control aspects of private schooling. And so basically, I like to say is that what you have with that is taxation without representation. Yes. That is, we're taxing the public to put monies into schools where the public has no representation. So it is taxation without representation.
It certainly is.
Yes. And read that religious schools, because that's the aim, to put them in religious schools so that they can first get their minds, and secondly, it's political. Mm-hmm. We'll all be having to go to church on Sunday, and if you fall asleep, you'll have a feather, you'll be tickled with a feather under your nose.
I think you put your finger on a hidden agenda here. Hidden agenda, Sally. Yeah, that really concerns me, is that that there is a hidden agenda. I believe there's a hidden agenda here to in fact, to circumvent the legal and other restrictions about money to religious schools. I might, just by way of background, say that I have some personal interest in this, because I in fact was raised in the Edgewood district and attended Loma Park and Stafford, and was a freshman at junior high at the old Edgewood High School before it was destroyed some years back. And by one of these...
By a CEO?
No, this was in the 60s that I was attending. But this guilt thing that you mentioned, the guilt about not being picked, I always phrased to other people this way: by pure luck, I had the opportunity to finish my high school education at Keystone, which is considered one of the premier schools in town, and certainly not by the financial means of my parents. And I have always had this personal feeling, what about all of my friends that I went through grade school and junior and freshman, and they didn't get the opportunity that I got. And being sort of a populist by personal bias, I always think that when people say, well, our society's going to hell in a handbasket, and what are we going to do to make things better? And then they say, keep all of the money from my taxes in my district and make the schools for my children premier schools, and let the kids who live down the block across the school district boundary, let their schools deteriorate, but somehow I can't seem to come to grips with the idea that those kids down the block who don't get adequate education sometimes take out frustrations or behave inappropriately other ways that education might, in a manner, remedy. So I really agree that in some ways this idea of charity not replacing justice is almost like saying, you know, the slaves on our plantation are treated so well, you know. I buy our slaves such nice clothes and I put them in such a nice house. Why aren't they happy to be slaves, you know? So, yeah, this charity doesn't replace justice. I agree thoroughly.
I think that the other point that was made here, and we can explore, is the fact that there is a different curriculum. There is a hidden agenda. And the curriculum in public schools, although I do have my criticism, many criticisms about public schools, and I know it can improve in many different ways. I'm not here saying that it doesn't stand an improvement. I work in public schools myself. I work with student teachers, and my wife has been a teacher for many years, and I also taught. But I believe the curriculum of public schools is geared towards tolerating differences. Diversity is recognized, diversity is celebrated. And in the curriculum that you find in private schools, unfortunately, is geared towards exclusion, towards intolerance of different views. Basic values are taught in both public and private schools, but the social values taught in public schools are consistent with all faiths and all creeds. Whereas when you look at private schools, those values are conjoined, or they're conjuncted with a dogma specific to a single faith. And you wonder, what do we want our public monies being used to teach dogma and teach a specific faith, which I think, of course, is in violation of the principle of the separation of church and state.
Well, it is. And how did it get this far along that we're doing all these terrible things? It's not right.
Well, it got far along because, let me tell you, it's ironic that on the one hand, the public has no access to what happens in private schools in terms of making decisions, whereas the religious right has availed itself of taking over public schools and public school elections and have imposed their views on public. Of course, there's been a reaction to that. And you see this in the curriculum in terms of health books. There's certain elements or certain teachings in health books that had to be removed because the religious right were offended. We're talking about teaching about AIDS or sexually transmitted diseases. And there's also science. How are you going to teach geology? How are you going to teach evolution in a private parochial school? Really different than what you would teach it in a public school.
I'm sure.
Because it's not biblically based. Now, I have no problems with people choosing to go to private schools and paying for that. We live in a free country. They have a right to do so. But what they don't have a right to is public monies to teach science and history and literature from such a dogmatic perspective.
It's scary. I don't like that at all.
And I think, you know, the thing of the two things, one the hidden agenda, and I liked your point about essentially euphemisms. They come up with this, you know, I mean, everyone does it in politics, you know, Americans for truth and justice or something, and you don't know what they're for, you know. They could be for very subversive kinds of ends.
They frequently are.
Yeah.
They always have wonderful patriotic sounding titles.
Right, exactly. And so I've forgotten, what does CEO stand for again?
Children's Educational Opportunity.
Right, and as a matter of...
Who could be against that?
Big business. Well, this is big businesses that got together and got this money and said, let's do it. Why didn't they just give the money to Edgewood? Then they could have a better school.
There's a background to this. And the background is that for many years, as many of us know here in San Antonio, Edgewood has struggled with the problems of unequal funding. Texas still doesn't have equal funding.
I don't understand that.
And there's a history of that. Now, when you look at that history, and then you look at all these millions, because they say it's $5 million over a 10-year period, that they're willing to fund vouchers for who knows how much money might come in. All this money that had up to this point been denied, public monies, to these poor schools, now they're using these vouchers to further erode. And this is ironic that it should happen in Edgewood, where the poor school districts and the very school district that brought the suit, because of that unequal funding, is now being directly attacked, I may say, by this generosity that draws public monies away from a school district that needs it the most.
I mean, I keep going back to some of the struggles for civil rights of minorities, where, say, after the Civil War, a black family has a plot of land and is trying to establish a family farm, and someone says, well, we'll pay for your children to go away and be educated. Well, how can you, it's difficult to say, no, I don't want to give my children the opportunity to go away and be educated. But the consequence of that is that the family farm that they were trying to establish to improve the family unit economically is then deprived of their efforts, and the family as an economic unit fails. And so it's for a supposed good, a more long-term objective, and perhaps a more significant objective, gets sacrificed.
Well, I worry too about the curriculum in the private schools. As you said, they have a narrower view of many things. What's going to happen if these children that are taken there is wonderful generosity by the CEO, and they have a limited education? The brightest are going to be wasted too. And here's another thing, it drives me crazy when they always say, the people who are in favor of this choice, vouchers, they say, well, this will make the public schools shape up and fly right, and they will improve. How can they improve with less money? Now, please tell me that, somebody.
There's a difference between public school choice and private school. In other words, I think many of us who in public education are in favor of having parents the opportunity of having choices within the public school system. And I think that could work well. And it's worked well. You have magnet schools. Northside, you have Health Careers High School. Edgewood has established an arts high school. So I think that public school choice is a good idea because the money stays in public education. And then parents can choose within the public arena which schools they want, but the money isn't siphoned off elsewhere. And that's the problem with the private school choice.
Well, but here again, we have just so many of these better schools, they're not going to be able to take everybody either. So don't you think equalization is the best way to go? Let's make all the schools nice.
Well,
let's make them all good.
That's the purpose of establishing standards and establishing accountability. And in fact, Joe Bernal made a few statements there that day. Among them was that Texas now has an accountability system much better than ever before. And in fact, the Pew Charitable Trust gave them an A rating for looking at both equity and excellence when they're looking at establishing standards. And that's another big difference, is that with public monies to public schools, there are structures, there are standards that are established, and they're enforced by elected officials that we democratically elect. And if we don't like their policies, we can vote them in, we can vote them out. A taxpayer has the power to vote in and out and change policies in public schools. In private schools, they don't have that choice. The structures and the standards are not accountable to public scrutiny. And that's a problem, because then we pay taxes, but there's no accountability to the taxpayer if those students go to private schools.
There are a couple of, you bring up the point of equalization. I don't know if you may have seen it. I'm sure you probably did, Julio, some articles, I believe it was in our papers within the last month, about the entire border district and what was, I believe, termed an initiative that roughly ran from El Paso through San Antonio down into the Valley area, talking about a long-term pattern of denial of developmental funds and other things of that sort. And I have some friends who we've occasionally gone down to Laredo or someplace, and they say, well, now I'm in Mexico, and the phrase that I've used with them is, you don't understand. Mexico begins on West Commerce Street. That's really where Mexico begins. And that from my personal experience, that basically south of that line, south and west of that line, as shown, I think, by this, as indicated in this article, funds are denied. I mean, to the tune of, I don't know, thousands of dollars per year per student, basically, in terms.
Now, why do we do things that way?
Well, well, it has to do with the social structure of Texas and of the nation.
Yeah, you were going to get into the history of that.
A little bit of the history in terms of the, and you're referring to, I believe, is the higher education. See, there were two suits. There was one suit for public schools, with the Edgewood suit, and then there was another suit that came years later in the 80s, the mid to late 80s, having to do with higher education.
Exactly.
And they found that all the south of San Antonio, when it comes to dollars, degrees, and distance, students in that area had to travel a long way to get to universities and colleges. We're talking about publicly funded universities and colleges.
Sure.
There were millions of dollars less spent in the southern area, and there were fewer degrees. In fact, south of San Antonio, there are hardly any degree programs. That is PhD programs compared to those. And so there's a disparity there. And just by coincidence, perhaps, that's where Hispanics are mostly concentrated, you see, in the southern part of the state. Poverty is concentrated there, Hispanics are there, and traditionally they have not had the power, because let's not forget, it's a matter of political power.
Absolutely.
And one would think that in the democracy, there would be equity and justice. Well, unfortunately, equity and justice doesn't come without political power and without the exercise of power. That's why things are the way they are. And as people who are poor, regardless of what color or race they are, when people who are poor become empowered, use the vote, get politically involved, then things start happening for them and in their favor.
And they've been even asking for bookstores on the south side of town.
That's a wonderful story. That's a wonderful story. A good friend of mine, Timothy Duda, was involved with that movement. He's an educator in South End. It's a shame there are no major bookstores there.
It's ridiculous.
In the south and the whole south side. And what does that tell you? Business people don't care. I'm privileged to live in the northwest side, one of the fastest growing areas in San Antonio. And there's a lot of business there. There's a lot of development. Why couldn't some of that be happening in the southwest side? There's no reason why they shouldn't invest there.
I've never understood why not.
Well, the dome, they could have put that in the south side.
Yeah, they could have put that in.
Because there's so much room, because there's nothing going on.
Another hot issue.
Yeah. But I really that both of those things that you mentioned, I'm a constant bookstore patron, and it never occurred to me, just because I live north of downtown, it never occurred to me that there's a string of Barnes and Noble and B. Dalton and you name it, all along the North Corridor, but on the south side of town, I can't remember ever seeing a major bookstore. How can people avail themselves of education and become more literate if they can't get good books? And then the other thing, the article you mentioned about the universities and higher education, it suddenly struck me. Why was UTSA built on the north side of town? Why couldn't it have easily been built
central
on the far south side of town?
Or it could have been more central to it.
Which is why we have a UTSA downtown now. Because there was a struggle, this was before my time coming to San Antonio, but you probably remember, there was a struggle about where to even place UTSA. And some people didn't want it way on the north side as it is now. I think the land was given to them freely, and I think there was some economic factors. But now they have a downtown campus. Why? The purpose of that downtown campus is to be able to attract people from the downtown and the southern areas to try to equalize the distribution of these opportunities.
And I don't even know where it is. I was assuming all this time it was in somewhere near the Texan Cultures, the Institute of Texan Cultures, but it's not.
Further west. It's by the by I-35.
Santa Rosa
just
Hospital.
Oh, in there?
Yeah, just south of there.
You know where El Mercado is?
Yes.
Yeah.
Downtown? It's within a couple of blocks.
I didn't know we had any land down there.
El
Did they
Mercado.
build things from scratch, or were there buildings they could take over, or
I
what?
think there were buildings that were torn down in order to make that, that structure there. So there is a movement towards equalization. There's a movement towards having And I think we have to hold our public officials accountable. If there are no bookstores in the South, no business in the South, what are our representatives on City Council doing about it?
Exactly.
And I think that's important. But again, at least we have access to that, to these public officials. Public monies to private schools will not give us access to the decision-making process. And I think people tend to forget that.
Exactly.
The state's not going to be able to interfere in what they teach at all.
I still don't understand how anybody can be for it when they stop and study the ramifications of this gesture of generosity.
But you can't blame the parents. You'd want
Well,
the best
yes,
for your
but
child.
here again,
So you can't
you've got children that have parents that were kind of disinterested in the whole thing. If you don't get them young and get them trained up and give them a decent education, they're going to be the same kind of parents that really don't care. And these are the ones that I think are going to get left behind, the ones whose parents aren't aggressive and don't get out there and try. And anyway, it's wrong to leave people behind. It's just get in there and support your public schools, by golly.
and by the way, everybody's affected.
Yeah.
Who's going to pay for the Social Security? If the majority of public school students don't receive funding, don't receive an excellent education, they're not going to be prepared. They're not going to be ready to be competitive in the global market, and they won't be able to support us when we get older and we're on Social Security because the majority of students would have not been well educated. So we need to invest in public schools for our own good.
Exactly.
For the good of the whole nation.
Exactly.
Well,
we have about 3 minutes left, Catherine. I wonder if Julio might want to make a concluding remark, and then we'll wrap up.
I thought I just did.
You can conclude again. Do you have anything special there? Did you want to show them, hold up to the camera, that magazine, the Church State?
Okay, well, there's a lot of resources. I didn't bring anything, but I do have an old issue of Church and State, American United for the Separation of Church and State. There's other publications out, and this publication does provide a lot of information about what's happening in vouchers in different states and different parts of the nation. I would just advise people to look at different sides, search out information. Don't just rely on the newspaper. Search out information from different sources. And
you can even think it through on your own. I mean, if you've got a mind that works, turn it around and make it click, click, click a little bit, and I'm sure that you'd come to the same conclusion that we have. Vouchers are bad business. Wrong, bad things. Okay.
Do we have time for a quick question for Julio?
Go ahead.
When you were at that debate or luncheon, whatever it was, did they bring out where this $50 million came from?
It came from private sources, and I think that's probably a matter of public record. I haven't read all that. I can't tell you that, but they are all private sources. Millionaires, wealthy people, generously giving money to this.
And all, by the way, I think most of them very Christianly oriented.
So, yes.
Is it time for Don to do something?
Well, actually, I just want to take a moment to appeal to our audience to give serious thought to the kinds of issues that we've discussed here today. Catherine has been a soldier in the trenches for these many years, trying to get people to look at all sides of an issue. And we often discuss religious subjects, but we also like to encourage you to think about things in terms of evidence and do a comparison of evidence on both sides. We're named Freethought Forum. We want to make sure that you think for yourself. Please join us again on Freethought Forum for our next episode. Thank you very much.
I think as I please, and this gives me pleasure.
My conscience decrees, this right I must treasure.
My thoughts will not cater
To duke or dictator, no person can deny. Die Gedanken sind frei, no person can deny. Die Gedanken sind frei. And should tyrants